And one of the reasons you hear people saying, well, there's no archaeological evidence for the Exodus. You know why they're saying that? Because they're looking 200 years too late. Look, there's only really two things you need to establish. You need to establish they were there at a certain time, and then you need to establish that they left and went to Canaan, what we would now call Israel. Did that really happen? We're going to try and figure out who is this Pharaoh's daughter that pulled him out of the Nile. And the best evidence suggests it's, who do you think it is? Has anyone heard? Very famous woman in Egyptian history. Cleopatra? No, way too late. Cleopatra's much later. Yes, someone said it. It is Hatshepsut. Who is Hatshepsut? You see this temple right here? That's her mortuary temple. Now, here's the genealogy. These dates are not set in stone. Chronology in ancient Egypt is highly debated. In fact, many Egyptologists would probably move this a couple of decades closer to us, all right? But these are the dates that my Egyptologist, who we had as a guide in Egypt, said he thinks these are the correct dates. So there's Thutmose the First. Now, Thutmose the First is the Pharaoh, in our view anyway, in the Bible who's ordering the death of the babies, okay? So Moses, by this dating, is probably born around 1526. Okay, so he's what? He's 13 years into Thutmose the First's reign. This guy has Hatshepsut by a wife. That's the only child by that wife that survives. She's a daughter. He also has Thutmose II from another wife. He then marries Hatshepsut, and he has only a short reign. He produces, after Hatshepsut pulls Moses out of the river, he produces Thutmose III, who has a 54-year reign. This is the guy that wanted to kill Moses, and we'll explain why here in a minute, all right? So she, Hatshepsut, assumes the throne for about 22 years while this guy's at military school. So of this 54-year reign, he only really reigns himself for 32 years because the first 22, she's reigning. You guys with me on this? You guys keeping score at home? All right, okay. Now, he gives birth to Amenhotep. His wife gives birth to Amenhotep II, who is a very arrogant pharaoh, and we think this is the Exodus pharaoh. Now, underneath this mortuary temple, if you go out here, if you see this long walkway here, well, it's off camera here, but to the right here, down a hill is an entryway to another tomb. And this is what the entrance looks like. They built an awning over it, and it goes down. But look at what this sign says above it. Senenmut, from the 18th dynasty. Senenmut means mother's brother. There are some archaeologists that are saying this is Moses. This is his Egyptian name. Because, you know, there are many different names. Remember when Daniel and his colleagues were taken to Babylon, they gave them Babylonian names. Well, maybe they gave Moses this name. Mother's brother? Well, anyway, what we're going to see here in this short video, we just took this in December of 2024. You're going to see we're going to see me standing in the mortuary temple right about there. And we're going to explain that this guy, Amenhotep II, tried to erase Hatshepsut's name from her own temple. And why do you think he wanted to do that? Well, let's see. Let's take a look.
The 1619 Project was not the first attempt to rewrite history. They tried to rewrite history in ancient Egypt as well. We're in the Hatshepsut Temple, and she was the woman that pulled Moses out of the water and later for a time became Pharaoh herself. Well, her name has been scratched out of her temple at certain points by Amenhotep II. He tried to replace his name with it. Why? Because Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus who got dope-slapped by Yahweh and Moses, and he didn't want any memory of Hatshepsut, who brought up Moses. So he tried to take over this temple for himself, even though it was built by Hatshepsut, probably designed by Moses himself. In fact, some people say Moses's Egyptian name was Senenmut, and Senenmut's grave, or I should say tomb, is almost under this temple, at the front of this temple. That tomb was never used. It was destroyed because Moses obviously left Egypt, went to Midian for 40 years, and when he came back, he was not going to be buried here. He took the Israelites just outside the Promised Land.
You might be surprised to learn that we have mummies for all of these guys. And here they are, okay? This is Tutmos I. He wanted to kill the Hebrew babies, all right? Tutmos II was the sickly one that died young, married Hatshepsut, his half-sister, left a 2-year-old son to reign, Tutmos III, right here. Look at that head. Wow. 54-year reign, wanted Moses dead. And this guy, Amenhotep II, is who we believe to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Because in order for Moses to come back to Egypt, the guy that wanted him dead had to have died. But remember, he spent 40 years in Midian. So the reign of the Pharaoh that wanted him dead had to be longer than 40 years. The only guy with a reign longer than 40 years in this time frame is that guy right there, Tutmos III. And so when his son takes over, God says, you can go back now. All right, now let's take a look at this guy. You notice anything unusual about his skin? By the way, this picture was taken in about 1902. You notice anything unusual? Can anyone see what's unusual about this guy? Scars from boils. I was reluctant to talk about these boils because I hadn't heard many archaeologists talk about them. But my guide alerted me to them back in December of 2024 in Egypt. And then I read an article that the Armstrong Foundation put out where another archaeologist alerted me to it. And then, well, it might be, we don't know for sure, but it might be from the 6th plague, okay? Let's start right here at the Egyptian Book of the Dead and go to Exodus chapter 7 and Exodus chapter 8, because there's a couple of scriptures in this section of the book of Exodus that'll be relevant to the Egyptian Book of the Dead. One comes from Exodus 7, where it says, "You, Moses, are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders, he will not listen to you." Now, a lot of people have consternation with this idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, because if you harden Pharaoh's heart, well, how do you make him responsible for not obeying you? Why don't you soften his heart so he can obey you? Doesn't it seem like God is being unfair here? But you also see that Pharaoh hardened his heart first, and God completed the process. And Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 1, right? If you suppress the truth long enough, God's going to give you up to your own desires, to the point that you not only have futile thinking, you're given up to a depraved mind where you're not only doing evil, but you're cheering on other people who are doing evil, which is a perfect description of our culture today. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32 explains why our culture is the way it is, because we suppress the truth to do our own thing. We hold it down, our hearts get hard, our minds get futile, we become depraved, and we start cheering on evil. So why all this business about hardening the heart? It actually goes to a tomb that was discovered down here in Thebes, also known as Luxor currently. And it is a papyrus found that is now known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Egyptian Book of the Dead. And this papyrus was in a tomb of Hunnefer from 1300 or so BC. And if you look at these drawings here, these drawings are actually showing you the theology of the Egyptian afterlife. And if the heart, do you see the heart right here? It's on a scale, and it's being weighed against a feather. So if the heart outweighs a feather, the alligator-headed demon goddess Amit waits hungrily to devour his heart, to devour his soul. Let's look at the biblical significance of this. First of all, it explains the biblical detail of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. It becomes stone-like. Pharaoh wasn't just stubborn, he was being condemned. In other words, Moses knows the theology of the Egyptians. Just like he knew all the gods and writes about all these plagues that slam the Egyptian gods, he knows that their view of the afterlife is, if a Pharaoh's going to make it to the afterlife, his heart better be pure. His heart better be light. So God comes along and says, I'm going to harden your heart. In other words, you ain't going to make it in the afterlife according to your own theology, which is the next point. In the plagues, God conquered false gods, humiliated Egyptian priests and royals. He showed that Pharaoh would be judged by his own theology. This is where the language comes from. And Pharaoh hardened his heart first. God just completed the process. Now, I don't think this is necessarily saying that, just like in Romans 9, he's not necessarily saying Pharaoh's in hell. He's saying that Pharaoh disobeyed Yahweh, and so Yahweh decided that he was going to judge Pharaoh and free the people of Israel. And that's what happened. So whenever you think about this hardening, it's just demonstrating. I mean, why would they use that term? It's demonstrating that they know what the Egyptians believed about the afterlife and what they believed about judgment. This stela behind me was found in 3 pieces and put back together. It's a stela erected by the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Amenhotep II. And in this stela,
he brags that he went into Canaan and got 101,000 slaves and brought them back to Egypt. Now, why would Amenhotep II, the pharaoh of the Exodus, need 101,000 slaves? Maybe because he just lost a whole bunch of them in the Exodus.
This is very interesting. This is the elephantine stele of Amenhotep II, the pharaoh of the Exodus. That's our theory anyway. Go to Exodus 14. All Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. At daybreak, the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the entire army of Pharaoh. Not one of them survived. All right, what does this have to do with a stele or a stela on an island in the Nile? Well, this stela right here was found on this island, which still exists today in the Nile. Comes from about 1440 BC, and it records one campaign by Amenhotep II, who raided Canaan, where he brought back 101,128 slaves, according to this thing. Now, why? Why would he even need to do this? He must have lost something. He lost his brick masons in the Exodus, perhaps. This is all circumstantial, right? We're just pointing out that this stele comes from this guy, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He decides, after the supposed date of the Exodus, he's got to go to Canaan and get a whole bunch of slaves. And the biggest slave raid prior to this time by an Egyptian pharaoh was apparently 5,700 slaves. This guy's saying he's got over 100,000 in one raid. And most scholars say he's exaggerating. By the way, there's one other thing you need to know about Amenhotep II. He's a braggart, a big braggart. He's very stubborn, which fits with the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Now notice, they didn't believe the numbers are exaggerated, but the timing and circumstance nevertheless provide indirect evidence for the Exodus. And here's the biblical significance of this. It suggests this early date for the Exodus. Why? Because his reign began just prior to 1446 BC. Before him, Thutmose III, his father, had a vast army with 17 successful campaigns. But despite being remarkably boastful, Amenhotep II records only 2 successful campaigns in his reign. His father, who reigned for 54 years, that guy we had up here earlier, 17 military campaigns. Amenhotep, however, records only 2. And if you might want to ask the question, what happened to his army? Or why the need to replace lots of slaves? It could be that he lost a lot of his army in the Exodus, in the Red Sea. He couldn't do what his father had been doing, and he had to go recover a lot of slaves. Now, can we be 100% sure of this? No. I'm just giving you the evidence from the inscriptions, and then we've got to put all the pieces together. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, right? This could be evidence for it. Maybe it isn't. It sure seems interesting to me, though. Why would this guy say he had to go get a whole bunch of slaves? Here is the granddaddy of them all. Go to Exodus 3:15. This is nomads of Yahweh. This is Yahweh's name, the great I am. And it's also put forth as Yahweh. And it's called the Nomads of Yahweh inscription. Sometimes it's called the Shasu of Yahweh name ring. We'll get to that here in a minute. And it was found in 2 Egyptian temples in modern-day Sudan. Soleb, that's a 1400 BC inscription, and Amara West, a 1300 BC inscription. So you've got two Yahweh inscriptions in ancient Egypt. We don't have, as far as we know to this point, any Yahweh inscription that early from Israel.
And it's on this pillar right here on the backside. It's right here. I've come a very long way to see this inscription, which from the Egyptian hieroglyphics reads, "Land of the nomads of Yahweh." It dates to the end of the 15th century BC. It's over 3,400 years old, and that makes it the oldest mention in an inscription of the name of the God of Israel.
So basically, this inscription is saying there were nomads in Egypt who worshiped Yahweh. So this seems to me to be quite stunning evidence that you can respond with when somebody says there's no evidence that the Israelites were even in Egypt. Oh, really? Why are there inscriptions in Egypt? The oldest inscriptions ever that say Yahweh, these people worship Yahweh. And if you do the biblical dating, we talked about this before, 1 Kings 6:1 will show you that the date of the Exodus is 1446 BC. And if they wander for 40 years, the date of the conquest of Jericho is going to be 1406 BC. And when you get down to Jericho, this is what you see. This is what we call a tell. This was the city that Joshua took in 1406 BC. You can see they've got a little area here that they've created a welcome center. These are buses right here. So when you go to Jericho, you'll go right here, and then you can walk throughout this tell. And so Joel Kramer here, this is his book, Where God Came Down. He has a great YouTube channel. I don't know if any of you have gone to it since last time, but if you go to Expedition Bible, you'll see he's got about 40 videos on great archaeological discoveries related to the Bible. And I'm going to show you about 3 minutes of one of them related to Jericho, because he went there and he brought Peter Parr and Bryant Wood with him. And he explains in this 3-minute clip of a much longer video what they found with regard to the walls when they did the excavations. Okay, remember, Parr not a believer, Bryant Wood is. Okay, here we go.
Joshua 6:20 says that on the seventh day, at the sound of the trumpets, the wall collapsed.
And the Bible is very specific in how it describes that event. The Hebrew wording there is the walls takatha, fell beneath themselves. And on the seventh trip around, we're told in the Bible, the mud brick wall collapsed and it fell outward and down to the base of the stone retaining wall. And when the archaeologists dug in this area, they found this pile of mud bricks all the way along the retaining wall.
So where I am right now is where the pile of red bricks were found.
That's correct.
The Germans, Garstang, and Kenyon all found these piles of collapsed mud bricks while excavating at the base of the stone retaining wall.
Then she shows that she dug down the side of that the outside of that revetment wall, and then there were reddish collapsed bricks that she said came from the top of that stone wall.
Yes. Which is another reason to suppose that these weren't, there were walls on top. They're not in situ, but the collapsed brick has come down. Yes. If you have a brick wall sitting on top of a stone revetment and it falls over, where else can the bricks go? They've got to go to the bottom.
And so with that pile of bricks, what does that
what does that tell us? Does that tell us that there was a destruction of the wall?
Certainly. It certainly is evidence of that destruction.
These fallen bricks from the city wall can be seen in this diagram from Kenyon's excavation report. In her write-up, she makes it clear that it was not the stone retaining wall that fell, but rather the mud brick wall that once stood on top of it.
And so she writes that up in her report, that here we have a collapsed city wall, and here's the evidence for it.
The archaeological understanding of how the walls of Jericho fell matches well with the ancient description of the wall falling beneath itself.
This find of a collapsed city wall found here at Jericho is unique in archaeology. At no other site have we found evidence for a city wall that has fallen down.
Yes, there were remains of the mud brick that had fallen down. I mean, that wall came tumbling down.
So the Bible says that the wall came tumbling down. The archaeologists then came and dug Jericho, and what did they find? They found a collapsed city wall. This fits perfectly with the description from the ancient text.
And when you have that text and you have the archaeology and you can fit them together, then you have the evidence from both sides, the literary evidence and the actual physical evidence from what the Bible is talking about.
Now, here's Kenyon's drawing again. Remember, she's not a believer. There was fallen mud brick that came off this wall, and remember the second wall we had up there? They both came down and created this ramp. So when the Bible says they're just going to shout, the walls are going to come down, and they're just going to walk into the city, that's exactly what it appears what happened. And then how does Egypt help confirm the Hebrew conquest? For that, we got to go to Egypt. And when you go to Egypt, you're going to find something down here in this city called the Amarna letters. Way back in 1891, William Flinders Petrie found what are called the Amarna letters. And there are 382 of these things found in this place in Egypt between Cairo and Luxor that reveal life in Canaan when the Israelites were taking the land between 1400 and 1300 BC. So these letters are talking about what's going on in what we would call modern day Israel. But they're in Egypt. Why would they be in Egypt? Because as we're about to see, there are correspondence between pharaohs of Egypt and people in Israel, or Canaan at the time. All right? And they're two-sided, they're cuneiform tablets, they're 2.5 to 9.5 inches each, and there are several references to the Haparu, or Habaru, the Egyptian equivalent of Hebrew, which could also be a generic derogatory term for enemies. Now, what did these things say? Well, kings in the area of Canaan, what we call modern-day Israel, they need help from the Harabu, because of the Harabu. In other words, they're asking the Pharaoh to help them because these Hebrews are threatening them. So, about 150 or more of these letters were between Canaanite kings and Amenhotep III around 1400 BC. So his grandfather, Amenhotep II, was probably the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Let my people go, that guy, right? So now there are people in Canaan, and Egypt was trying to exert its influence on Canaan. They're writing to the Pharaoh saying, we need help. The king of Gezer, you remember Gezer? Gezer's where they found all those child sacrifice jars. The king of Gezer pleads with Pharaoh to help him so that the Harabu do not destroy us. Others mention doing battle with the Habaru. And one of the tablets mentions Labayah, king of Shechem, giving the land to Shechem, a city-state, to the Harabu. So in other words, there was no battle. It was a peaceful transition of power. So the biblical significance: Habaru, Hebrew, slave lower class, It could be forced labor or Slavic ethnicity. It could mean Hebrew. It supports the biblical date of the conquest, since Canaanite kings talked with Amenhotep III about their problems with these Haribu, and explains why Shechem wasn't included in the list of conquests. You didn't need to take it. They were just going to give it to you. The Berlin pedestal. It says Berlin because it's in Berlin now. It's in the one of the museums in Berlin. It wasn't found in Berlin, okay? And this is very interesting. Go to Exodus 19. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God is trying to make a nation through whom he's going to bring the Messiah. And you know, I think in Deuteronomy he says, I didn't choose you because you were great. I didn't choose you because you're better than anyone else. In fact, you're the least of all peoples. But I chose you to show my glory through you. And so this is what he said he's going to do. He's going to make them a great nation. The question is, when were they a nation? When did they become a nation? And for this, we've got to go to Egypt. We're not exactly sure where this was discovered, but this is called the Berlin pedestal. It was discovered by Ludwig Borchardt. When? About 1913, we think in Egypt. And it's housed now in Berlin's Egyptian Museum. They think it's between 1550 and 1292 BC. It's bought off an Egyptian antiquities dealer. Each nameplate or cartouche, they call it, has hieroglyphics, and it suggests an Egyptian origin. Otherwise, we're not really sure what the origin is. And so this is a hieroglyphic cartouche. And you say, well, what are these? What do these mean? Well, it contains the oldest but disputed mention of Israel. You see this cartouche over here? It's like cracked right here. There's a piece of it missing. And they think this is Israel. Why? We'll get to it here in just a minute. The dispute is negligible, however, since the name Israel is partially intact and the rest inferred from the context. What's the context? Here it is. Check this out. This nation of Ascalon, this nation of Canaan, this nation of Israel. You can see what we don't have here is the red part. We have the black, we don't have the red. It would be like if I said, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You would know what the third one was. They go together. Or if I said I'm going to go to the West Coast. I'm going to visit California, Oregon, and What are you going to say? Washington, right? Even though I might not have the whole word there, you know in context what this means. So, what's the significance of this biblically? Israel existed as a nation for a time alongside Canaan, as scripture testifies in Joshua and Judges. And also the nation of Israel already existed before the late date proposed for the Exodus. What's the late date proposed for the Exodus? Like around 1275 BC. We'll see here in a few minutes that seems that the best evidence shows the Exodus took place in the 1400s, not the 1200s. And one of the reasons you hear people saying, well, there's no archaeological evidence for the Exodus. You know why they're saying that? Because they're looking 200 years too late. If they looked 200 years earlier in the 1400s, they'd find everything we're talking about here.
Hey, we're in the Valley of the Kings near Luxor, Egypt, just across the Nile River from Karnak and the Luxor Temple. This is the tomb of Merneptah. He followed Ramses II. He is the guy that in 1208 erected the Merneptah stela which says on there that he laid waste to the seed of Israel. This is one of the earliest references to Israel ever, and it does show, it seems, that Israel had to be in the land long before 1208 BC in order for him to lay their seed waste. That was a brag, Stella. In other words, he was bragging that he won, and he exaggerated that because obviously Israel lived on after that. Anyway, we're going to go into his tomb and see what we can find.
This is the tomb of Pharaoh Merneptah, who died in 1203 BC. You see the scarab here? That was a symbol of resurrection. He is the guy that said Israel's seed is laid waste. Israel still exists. He doesn't. This, of course, is the top of the sarcophagus, Pharaoh Merneptah, laying down at least 80 steps into the ground here in the Valley of the Kings. Merneptah is still bragging long after he's dead. These are prisoners on his tomb. Obviously, the plaster's fallen away, so they've redrawn the prisoners. Here's one on the plaster. These are all prisoners, hands tied behind their backs. There's the key of life right there. The key of life representing resurrection in Merneptah's tomb.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the most amazing archaeological discoveries in history related to the Bible. This is the Merneptah stela. There was a pharaoh in Egypt by the name of Merneptah. He came right after Ramses II. And this stela, this victory statement, comes from 1208 BC. So this thing is over 3,200 years old. And if you look down here, you can see how it's kind of worn more black because people were actually touching the inscription that mentioned that Israel as a nation had been laid waste by Pharaoh Merneptah in 1208 BC. Well, how could that be if the Exodus took place in the 1200s, like many people say? The much more consistent date for the Exodus, according to the Bible and archaeology, is the Exodus took place in the 1400s BC, particularly according to the Bible, 1446 BC. That would have given the Israelites enough time to get into the land and become a nation, so later Merneptah could brag that he had beaten them. This is amazing. It's 3,200 years old, and it's got Israel on it.
You